Right, and yeah, Angela already introduced some of my background, but yes, I'm very, very passionate about issues of data ethics and of getting people from all sorts of different backgrounds, often underrepresented and from different domains, involved with machine learning and with data science more generally. And so it's really great that topics like explainability and bias and fairness have gotten a lot more traction and a lot more awareness, but it's important that we continue to expand the conversation on ethics, which really Kate and David both shared some points I'm going to make earlier, so that's already happening. And the first is that explainability on its own is insufficient. And so you consider an algorithmic system that is making decisions about whether or not someone should get a loan. Often a question will be, why was my loan denied, if your loan is denied? But really the underlying question there is, what can I change about my situation to get a loan in the future? And this is a framing from Burke Eston. Let me put his info up. But this idea of actionable recourse. And so he says it should be actionable. So it's not okay to say, you know, your loan was denied because of your ethnicity, since that's discrimination, and that's also not something a person can change. It should be actionable, and there should be this mechanism for recourse. It should be possible for it to be changed. I mean, depending on the circumstances. And so I found this very helpful to think about, of kind of this underlying idea of actionable recourse. And so this shows up a lot of places. An example I return to a lot as kind of a touchstone is, but this is kind of a pattern that we see across many countries, and I'll share more examples that fit it in a moment. But in the US, there is an algorithm to determine poor people's healthcare benefits. And when it was implemented in one state, there was a bug in the code that incorrectly cut care for people with cerebral palsy. And so this woman, Tammy Dobbs, was one of the people that lost care, again, due to a software bug. And she needed this care for very basic life functioning, to help her get out of bed in the morning, to get her breakfast. And she's interviewed and says, you know, I asked for an explanation and they didn't give me one. They were just like, this is what the algorithm said. But really what she wanted was a mechanism for recourse to get that decision changed. And eventually it comes out through a lengthy court case, but it was certainly not an ideal setup. And this illustrates a kind of a common issue that shows up again and again, which is often automated systems are implemented with no way to identify and address mistakes. And there are a few reasons for this. Often automation is being used as a cost-cutting measure, and having kind of robust error checking in place and ways to surface mistakes would cost more. There can also be biases of people, you know, mistakenly believing that computers are objective or don't make errors. And so this is an issue that shows up many places. Human Rights Watch just this month put out a report on AI use. So I think it's more broadly really automated system use in the EU for social benefits. And country after country has pretty alarming examples where there were errors, and again, kind of no clear way to surface them. So a case in France where an algorithm to determine food benefits made errors in at least 60,000 cases. And they interview one woman who her case manager, identified, yes, this is a bug. You should have received these benefits, but said, I don't have the power to reinstate them. So they could see the bug, but couldn't change it. And so that's quite concerning, and it's a very kind of well-documented pattern. There are a set of principles. So another domain area is content moderation. And there are a set of principles, the Santa Clara principles, which were developed by a group of ethicists. They're not actually observed by the major platforms, but I want to share in particular principle 3 because I love the wording, which is that companies should provide a meaningful opportunity for timely appeal. And so I really like this idea of appeal being meaningful and timely. And I think this is relevant far beyond content moderation, because too often when there is a way to try to report a mistake, you submit a form and you just get an automated response that clearly hasn't been read, or you have to wait months. But the importance of appeals being available, meaningful, and timely. Another kind of related, so I've talked about expanding explainability to include actionable recourse. Another idea is contestability. And this is, there was a CSCW workshop on this maybe 2 years ago, but this is still a newer idea, and I would love to hear people's ideas on kind of what this could look like. But the idea with contestability is to, when you're building an algorithmic system, to include mechanisms for questioning and disagreeing with results as part of the system, rather than as an external add-on. And so I kind of think too often we're kind of, building a system, assuming, okay, this is going to work, work well. And then when there are errors and issues, it kind of becomes this extra thing you're tacking on the end of like, okay, how can we try to dispute this or change this? And so I found this kind of very provocative to think about how could we include that kind of in the core of the system. And I had thought about this from a slightly different angle in my work with Fast.ai. And there we have this idea of what we call augmented machine learning. And so there's another area of auto machine learning that tends to be about kind of automating a process end to end. Whereas with augmented machine learning, we really wanted to think about what are the things that humans are really good at, and how can we take advantage of human strengths, as opposed to simply trying to automate everything and then being left with weird gaps of stuff that computers are not doing well. And how can humans and computers work together? And so I think that that's important to keep in mind with system design as well. So that was a bit on expanding our conception of explainability. Next up is fairness and bias. And so definitely good to be thinking about fairness and bias, but that alone is insufficient. So I would imagine that many of you are familiar with the Gender Shades research on facial recognition by Joy Balamwini, Timnit Gebru, and Deborah Raji. But they evaluated commercial computer vision products that had been released from a number of big name companies, including Microsoft, IBM. There was a follow-up study on Amazon. And for all of them, they found that they performed worse on women than on men, and worse on people with dark skin than on people with light skin, leading to pretty terrible results for dark-skinned women. And so kind of IBM's results are typical, where they had 99% accuracy on light-skinned men, 99.7% actually, and just 65% accuracy on dark-skinned women. And so this is, huge really harm that these products were released with such a discrepancy. However, some people have kind of taken a superficial reading of this research, which is not what the original researchers were saying at all, and said, oh, okay, the solution is purely we need to get more pictures of dark-skinned women, and then we're set, right? We just increase the accuracy. And this is true. This was an issue with the representation of the underlying training set that does need to be addressed. So is that problem totally solved? Unfortunately not, because we have to kind of look at how these systems are used and at many kind of underlying issues. And so in the US, in numerous cities, police have used facial recognition to identify Black people protesting police racism and police murders of unarmed people. And so there's a huge power issue here when you look at this type of use of technology. And this is something that is, I believe, unethical, whether it works or not. Like it's certainly terrible when you're misidentifying people, but it's also, I think, a threat to civil rights to be identifying protesters in this sort of situation, and allowing police to do that more accurately has kind of a different set of downsides and drawbacks. And so Dr. Timnit Gebru, who's kind of a world premier AI researcher and one of the Gender Shades researchers, wrote, a lot of times people are talking about bias in the sense of equalizing performance across groups. They're not thinking about the underlying foundation, whether a task should exist in the first place, who creates it, who will deploy it on which population, who owns the data, and how is it used? And so these are all really crucial questions to be asking. These are questions of power that Kate Devitt was kind of getting at before, and they get beyond. So definitely you should be checking the error rates on different subgroups to make sure that you don't have these huge discrepancies and bias, but that alone is insufficient. And then I know the example I shared involving police was from the United States, but this is actually a kind of a pattern throughout history and throughout the world around how surveillance technologies are used. And as Professor Alvaro Bedoya has written, surveillance is used against those considered less than, against the poor man, the person of color, the immigrant, the heretic. It is used to try to stop marginalized people from achieving power. And so it's important to kind of recognize some of the history, and I'm really glad Gentry kind of opened up talking about history, but the history of different types of technologies have been used. And this even, Professor Bedoya gives examples that long predate computers, but kind of how surveillance is used, moving up into computerized. Another aspect of this I want to talk about is Robo Debt, which I would imagine you are familiar with, where the Australian government created unlawful debts for hundreds of thousands of people. This destroyed many lives to do this kind of through an automated system. And a detail that really struck me about Robo Debt is that the quote compliance interventions, which are issuing these debts to people for money that they, in most cases, did not actually owe, went from 20,000 per year, back when it was a more manual process, to 20,000 per week. And so you have this 50x scale up that is just huge of how they have scaled putting people into debt. And so this is another kind of aspect or pattern of what automation and what machine learning allow, is kind of this scale. And so we see this effect where machine learning often has the effect of centralizing power, and this is often unintentional because it can be implemented with no system for recourse and no way to identify mistakes. And so we saw this earlier with the people whose healthcare was wrongly cut due to a bug. Can be used at massive scale cheaply. So kind of what I just showed with Centrelink and Robo Debt, issuing so many debts at scale. Can also replicate identical biases or errors at scale. And I should note, I'm sharing all this because often when I point out various aspects of how automated systems can cause harm, people will point out in many cases, there are human analogs of, humans make mistakes, humans are biased. At the same time, there is something different about automated systems, and it's not just plug and play interchangeable when you switch from a human decision maker to an automated decision maker. They can be used to evade responsibility. And so this is true of bureaucracy in general. So even kind of non-automated bureaucracies, you often get a passing of the buck of, I was just following orders, or it's this other person's fault. However, as Dana Boyd has pointed out, automated systems are often being used to extend bureaucracy and kind of add just even another layer of complication and another place to point. And so in the example I shared with the healthcare software that had a bug, the journalist interviewed, so the creator of that software is earning royalties off of it, it's through this kind of private company, and he was interviewed and he said, it's not my responsibility to offer an explanation, and then he blamed policymakers, but the policymakers could blame the particular people that implemented this software. And so you have this real kind of everyone pointing to somebody else and a different kind of node in the system. And I bring this up not because I want blame for the sake of blame, but if nobody takes responsibility for a system, you're not going to get good outcomes. Can also create feedback loops, and feedback loops are where you basically create the outcome that you were trying to predict, where you kind of your data kind of quickly becomes tainted kind of from the output of your model. And they also can amplify not just encode bias. And so there have been multiple papers on this where if you start with a biased data set, you can actually train a model that is even more biased than your training set. And so in summary, this is kind of the reasons why machine learning can end up centralizing power. And these are also ways that machine learning and automated systems are different from human decision makers. There was an op-ed in Nature last year that was fantastic by Pratyusha Kalluri, asking us to change our question from, instead of asking, is AI good or fair, ask how it shifts power, and to more explicitly think about how power is being shifted around and changed through the systems that we build. So another thing I want to highlight about this healthcare example is that the people who needed healthcare and had it incorrectly cut saw the problem right away. And the issue was that there was no way to surface that mistake. Another really tragic example is Facebook's role in the genocide in Myanmar. And this is something that in 2018, the UN found that Facebook had played a, quote, determining role in the genocide. However, that was not a surprise to anyone who had been following it. Someone close to the matter said, this is not 2020 hindsight. The scale of this problem was significant and it was already apparent. And so going back to 2013, as early as 2013, people were trying to warn Facebook executives about how Facebook was being used in Myanmar to incite ethnic violence and to dehumanize an ethnic minority. So 2013, 2014, 2015, people were raising warnings and they were not listened to. And so it's really important to recognize that genocide typically does not come out of nowhere. It's something that gradually escalates. There were warning signs. And as kind of an indication of how little Facebook did to address the issues, at the start of 2015, they only had 2 contractors that spoke Burmese for the company, and that was kind of the extent of their Burmese language speaking. And then they, during 2015, hired 2 more. But compared to the number of users in Myanmar who were speaking Burmese, the primary language there, it was a very, very small number. They invested very little resources in this. And so this is, again, a pattern that we see kind of over and over, that often the people most impacted by a system have the least power. They recognize the issue earliest, but they're not listened to and don't have effective ways to raise an alarm. And they also best understand the needed interventions for addressing the ethical risk. And so it's really crucial that the people most impacted have avenues for participation and power. Really, really great workshop at ICML last year was the Participatory Approaches to Machine Learning workshop. And I believe all the talks and papers are available openly online. So I'd encourage you to check that out. But the organizers of the workshop highlighted that the designers of a machine learning system have far more power over the system than the individuals impacted, and pointed that out, that often even within algorithmic fairness or human-centered ML, we're often focusing on centralized solutions. And so that kind of just further centralizes the power of the creators. And they called for more democratic, cooperative, and participatory approaches. I do want to give you some practical resources as well. I always try to have something kind of practical in my talks. I love the Markula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University. Has a packet of resources online for ethics and technology practice. And in particular, I love their ethics toolkit. And this is a set of practices that you could implement within your organization. I will not go through all of them, but check them out. They have kind of eight tools or processes to keep in mind. And I'll just mention tool 3, expanding the ethical circle. And this is kind of about setting a regular time to make sure you're asking and really going through who are all the stakeholders who will be directly affected by a system, and also who will be indirectly affected in significant ways. Who might use this product for purposes we didn't intend, and whose skills, experiences, and values have we simply assumed rather than actually consulted. And so they go into more detail about this, but really kind of making sure that you are asking these questions and looking for these things. Another useful resource on this is the Diverse Voices project from the University of Washington Tech Policy Lab. And this includes both there's academic paper about it, but also practical how-to guides on how to assemble panels of groups that may not be well represented, and that whose input you definitely need, and to compensate people for these panels. And so they did examples, including people who are formerly or currently incarcerated, people who don't drive cars, extremely low income people, but to how to solicit input from these groups. So explainability on its own is insufficient. We need recourse, I should say actually actionable recourse and contestability. Fairness is insufficient. We need justice. And the people most impacted need avenues for participation and power. In summary, some kind of steps towards solutions are making sure you have ways to surface errors quickly, offering timely, meaningful appeals, meaningful consultation with voices that are often overlooked. And it's important to make sure that this doesn't just end up being tokenism, but that it really is leading to meaningful change. Designing products, processes, and technology with contestability in mind. And diversity in hiring, retention, and promotions, and that needs to consider countries and languages, which I think is a particular issue in the US, where a lot of kind of the major companies are based. And these are very difficult problems, but these are kind of some steps towards trying to do better with them. And then I'll close with a quote that I love. Data are not bricks to be stacked, oil to be drilled, gold to be mined, opportunities to be harvested. Data are humans to be seen, maybe loved, hopefully taken care of. And this is from AI researcher Inialua Deborah Raji. And she was also one of the authors on the gender shades research.